news is that the quarterly growth rate has gone up from the 5.3 for the last quarter of the previous financial year. That part is good. I still don't think I would call it a strong rebound. The kind of underlying consumption and investment activity that is currently on is perhaps reflected in the 5.5% GDP numbers that has come up. And this is unlikely.
On board his special aircraft while returning from the NAM summit in Iran, Dr. Singh said
he can't get into a slanging match with political leaders, and he has thus far maintained silence on the personal attacks on him as he lashed out at the opposition saying BJP is restless, grab power, and is resorting to diversionary tactics. That's Prime Minister speaking today on board Air India 1.
Well, if I were resigning, I wouldn't be here. We would certainly like to lay the foundations of a 9% growth rate, but international events have not helped. But also, I think lack of cohesion in our domestic politics has also been a factor. Unfortunately, from one crisis to another, but BJP's policy has been to disrupt Parliament. These are all diversionary tactics, and one has only 24 hours at one's disposal. If one is preoccupied all the time with handling these diversionary tactics, naturally that affects the capacity and the ability of the government to attend to its more fundamental task.
And of course continues to be the big political story, the entire logjam over the coal allocation, the allocation of those coal blocks and that CAG report. But remember, what's a bigger worry right now is that intense slowdown that we're seeing in the economy, perhaps not making as big headlines as it should be. But let me go across to Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw to make sense of how bad the situation really is. Everyone today seems to be saying there's no surprise in the 5.5% number, Mrs. Shaw, but isn't it something that should be worrying our policymakers much more than it really is?
Well, like you said, there's nothing to cheer about. I mean, 5.5% is very, very disappointing as far as I'm concerned. We are seeing very, very alarming signs. We are seeing, savings at an all-time low. We are seeing inflation at an all-time high. We are seeing all these declines in growth in industry, agricultural output, services sector. Our trade deficit is at almost 10% of our GDP, which is really, really frightening. Now, the way I look at it, we have a government that is in survival mode, and it seems to believe that no action or no decisions is the way to survive. And I think that's what we are facing today. If you leave alone some of the controversial FDI debates that we are having, we are seeing a huge decline in investment. Look at what's happening to infrastructure investment. It has more than halved from 2.2 trillion last year to 1 trillion is the estimate this year. When you look at just industry projects, that has also almost halved to about 2.1 trillion levels from about 3.9 trillion last year. So you can see investor confidence is down, business confidence is down, and government needs to make sure that it does something. Now all hopes are on Mr. Chidambaram, because he is somebody who we hope will wake up and do something. But unless we start investing in our infrastructure, if we don't address the power situation, if we don't address some of the urgent needs that we have in infrastructure in this country, I'm afraid we are really, really jumping off a cliff.
We're jumping off a cliff, and is anyone listening? That seems to be the question. Yes, there is optimism building up ever since we've got a new finance minister in charge. But now we've just seen a bit too much of this government bashing, wake-up calls for the government. Just about every top industry leader telling the government, you know what, we don't need those big ticket reforms. All we need is simple decision making. Sumant Sinha, what's stopping the government from moving forward in that?
Beats me, to be honest. No, I think this has been the situation for some time now. So, you know, now if nothing happens in this current political environment, I can still at least try to begin to understand it. But why it has been this way for the last few years, that I cannot understand. Now we've got ourselves into a situation where, you know, it's exactly the opposite of a virtuous circle. We have high inflation and low growth.
Right.
We've got high interest rates. And it is not apparent to, I think to me at least at this point, as to how we're going to break out of this situation and move back to some sort of a sustainable growth rate. Now, yes, Mr. Chidambaram coming in has lent a bit of hope and optimism yet again, to the whole situation. We've got a new chief economic advisor as well.
Right.
We've got a whole new team in the finance ministry to some extent. But you know, the problem is that the decisions that have to be taken at some level are difficult decisions. They are, you know, the easy decisions were never, you know, taken. So unfortunately now, you know, tackling the fiscal deficit, you know, decreasing subsidies, all of those are going to be very difficult to do. And in the backdrop of the kind of political situation that we have right now, with elections coming ever so closer, I don't know how the government is going to muster the political courage or the numbers to take on any of the slightly more difficult things. And even clearing projects now, you know, even that whole thing has gone into such a limbo with anything that the government seems to be doing, getting into some problem at some point in the near future. And so I don't even know that bureaucrats or even politicians are really in a mindset to do a lot at this point in time.
In fact, let me take forward what you're saying, because I interviewed Mr. N.R. Narayanamurthy yesterday in Bangalore, and he had a very important point to make. He's saying, I'm not talking about those tough political decisions. That's not what we're talking about. There are some low-hanging fruit out there, and all that we're talking about is the bureaucracy moving forward. And Mr. Bhede, I'd like you to respond to this question, because he's saying the progress of the country has been hit by no decision-making on part of the bureaucracy. In fact, citing an example saying that he met just about everybody who matters in North Block, including the finance secretary, including the chief economic advisor when Mr. Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister, simply asking for a clarification on software exports. Now, that's clearly not a politically tough decision. Why is the bureaucracy not moving? Why is it that decisions aren't coming through? Because that's part of the larger problem of the entire mindset of the investor sentiment taking a hit.
I thought I'd escape that question, having retired 2.5 years back. I think you have to remember one thing. The bureaucracy is not diverse from the environment.
Right.
And if you say that there's no certainty or consistency, that only the people who take wrong decisions will be penalized, you do lead to a situation even the better performers stop taking decisions.
So you admit that decisions
Frankly,
aren't being taken?
Well, I don't know. I'm not working in the system, but that's a perception everyone has. I'm only a little worried that all of us have started doing nano management, nano analysis, nano criticism of decisions. Everybody thinks the government is the only panacea for solutions. The whole society has to look at things. Are we all doing the same thing?
So are you saying even perhaps those industry leaders now need to stop looking at the government? Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, respond to that, because that is an interesting point that we've heard time and again, that why is it that industry leaders keep blaming the government for everything? It's the same industry that said we do not want government interference. So why is it that the industry is not being able to grow despite the policy paralysis?
Well, let me be very honest, Shweta. We are a regulated industry. Look at our own industry. The pharma sector is the second biggest sector in the country. It is over-regulated. We still don't have any clear direction in terms of any bureaucratic decisions being taken on clinical trials for that matter. We don't even have a regulatory system that is a permanent regulatory system. We have the Mashelkar committee report that was to be implemented over a decade ago. We are still not seeing all these things being implemented. And let me just make one statement. It's not as if the whole country is not moving ahead. There are a few states which are focused on growth. There are a few states taking decisions and moving ahead. Look at Gujarat. Look at Madhya Pradesh. Look at Bihar. These are states where the leaders are taking decisions. The bureaucracy is taking decisions. But I'm sorry, bureaucracy is not taking a decision in most other parts of the country, including Karnataka. So wherever state governments are in survival mode, and the center is in survival mode, they are not taking any decisions.
Sajid Chinoy, every time we have a discussion about where the economy is headed, we keep looking for new and new milestones where things will start turning around for the positive and we'll see some sort of an upside. I remember when we were talking earlier in the year in January, we were saying, you know what, perhaps let's wait for the budget, or let's wait for the UP elections to get over, then let's wait for the presidential elections to get over. Now we're talking about a new finance minister in place. Again, a very narrow window because we'll be back with state elections. So do you think, as an economist, you've really given up hope because the political environment seems to be overtaking the economic decision making, and also it seems to be a big distraction for things to move forward?
Yes, unfortunately, I think the entire economic reform process, or just the business of governance that influences the economy, has been held hostage to a political timetable over the last 12 to 15 months. And I think looking forward, the window, as you mentioned, is very narrow. We've got 10 state elections in 2013. You have the last budget before the 2014 election. If any decision is politically too hard for the next 6 months, it will likely be a hot potato for next year as well. So I think time really is running out. But I want to just draw your attention to today's numbers, because there is the perception in some corners that this is not as bad as it looks. This perhaps suggests that growth has bottomed. It was 5.3% last quarter. It's 5.5% now. Perhaps things will get better. Just want to caution everyone that these are year-on-year growth rates, and I don't want to get too technical, but what you really want to track is the sequential momentum, which is quarter-on-quarter, seasonally adjusted and annualized. If you look at the momentum of growth in India, it actually fell in the second quarter. The momentum in the previous quarter was 6.1%. In the second quarter, it was 5.3%. So the economy at the margin is worsening, not getting better. The other point I want to make is the driver of that growth. I mean, if you look at, we're well aware that investment has slowed over the last 2 years, but what was holding us up was consumption. If you now look at the profile of consumption over the last 3 or 4 quarters, it's fallen off very dramatically. And in this particular quarter, today's numbers suggested that private consumption is falling very rapidly. So if you have a situation where you have no investment pickup on the horizon, private consumption is slowing because inflation is high and incomes have slowed, and you're facing the prospect of agricultural production being weak later this year, once the growth process begins to moderate, you can get into a free fall very quickly. So I think any kind of complacency or resignation that we're stuck in the 5 to 6% range, I think is very dangerous, because you can propel downwards very, very quickly, which is why I think the government needs to act sooner rather than later.
We've heard that statement rather often, that the government needs to act sooner rather than later. But TC Srinivas Raghavan, nothing is moving the government. The important point that Sajid has raised there is that yet again we're seeing a response from the government that shows some sort of complacency, that it's not all that bad, and we've gone up from 5.3 to 5.5 quarter on quarter. But as Sajid was trying to explain, the numbers are much worse than what we're perhaps being able to visualize. What is it that will really wake up the government? What is it that will really change things, is my question to you, because I think by now all of us are even tired of discussing this issue, because we've discussed it for many months. We've just said this, wake up New Delhi, take some decisions, put in some actions in place, because the economy, there is a fear of a free fall, if I could quote Sajid there.
Well, Shweta, 2 or 3 things actually. One is that, yes, everybody's been going on saying that, the government should wake up and do something, take some decisions and so on. Now, the fact of the matter is that the government is not going to wake up because they are in election mode, as somebody just said. So, the central government is going to be hard to expect them to do very much more than focus on the expenditure side. So, they'll be looking for spending a lot of money. Now, that's fine. I mean, if they're going to buy a few things with it, like trucks or buses or whatever it is that produces or gives a kick up to the real sector, that's fine. But if they're going to waste a lot of money on subsidies and stuff, then that's a different kind of problem. Is going to feed inflation and so on. We all know what that means. But the other thing is that in any case, I mean, I have asked over the last 3 months, I've met many of these top captains of industry, and I said, what do you want the government to do which will kick up overall GDP growth rate? Now, one big problem is, I mean, when you ask these people, they only talk about their sector. Now, that's fine. Obviously, they can't talk about other sectors. But if the government did whatever every sectoral person wants to be done, is it going to make a difference to GDP growth rate? And if so, by how much? Now, there's no answer to that. It might not. I don't know. I think the third thing I want to say is that there is something called a business cycle. And we are all ignoring that. Pradeep, my good friend and of 35, 40 years, just said that, there's a lot of nano management. The fact of the matter is that we did enter into the downturn of a business cycle. We were on the upturn for a long time. Then we entered the downturn. We are not the only ones to have entered it. The rest of the world entered into it. The reasons might be different, but we are on the down part of the business cycle. Now, historically, no amount of policy tweaking, etc., is going to make much of a difference if you are on the down part of a business cycle. Mr. Shinoy is an economist. I'm sure he'll bear me out on this. Even the United States, after all those QE1 and QE2 and heaven knows what else, and pumping trillions of dollars into the economy, growth is faltering over there. Now, why does this happen? I don't think anybody has really been able to figure out why business cycles happen. You have different kinds of business cycles. We just have to accept the fact that we are on the down part of a business cycle, and we should be able to come out of it in I think, a couple of years. It's not going to happen for another 2 or 3 years. Is 5.5%
because I'm
bad?
going to get Sajid to actually respond to that. I'm going to get Sajid to respond to that. Would you agree with TCA's view that we're actually witnessing a downturn and it's part of the natural business cycle, and we'll have to go through it? I can see Kiran Shaw also nodding in disagreement, but Sajid, to you first.
Yeah, so I think it's tempting to say that this is a business cycle and it's cyclical, but I actually have a different point of view for a very simple reason. If in fact our potential rate of growth had not changed, it was 8% for example, and we're currently experiencing 5.5% growth, and we say it's cyclical, what we should have seen over the last year is a sharp falling off of core inflation. If you're experiencing a business cycle and you're growing below your capacity, core inflation should have fallen off very sharply. The fact that growth is below 6% for the last year and core inflation is running at 9% suggests to me that this is not cyclical, in fact it's structural. And the unfortunate implication of all of this is perhaps our potential rate of growth has fallen from 8% all the way down to 6 or 6.5% because of the lack of corporate private investment over the last 3-4 years. So I'm actually in the camp that that's what worries me, that this I don't think is a cyclical phenomenon. We're now moving from the cyclical to the structural.
Kiran Shaw, would you agree with that as well, that it's really structural, it's a slowdown that's getting more and more broad-based?
I absolutely agree with Sajid.
I think it's
really a systemic, structural. I think it's an absolutely structural, systemic problem, and I think it's really denying us of our true potential. I know for a fact that we as an organization have not been investing at the rate at which we should, and in fact we are even looking at investing overseas because the business confidence and the infrastructure support that we get in this country is pathetic.
Now that speaks volume, Mr. Raghavan. How do you explain a top industry leader, a captain of industry really saying there is no business confidence, it's pathetic, and it's something that has deteriorated? Now, isn't that something that should really worry the government? This is a government that's headed by an economist prime minister. Explain that to us, because what we're really seeing happen is that business confidence plummeting, and the sentiment seems to be getting worse day by day. We've never seen in the recent past so many top industry leaders being so critical of the government. There has to be a reason for it.
Well, of course there's a reason for it. Sort of top lines, bottom lines, everything are falling. As for business confidence, it's directly related in a very large measure to the political environment. Political environment for the last 2.5 years has been pretty awful. This is not the first time it's happening. It happens once every